Everyone laughed. Her boyfriend had his hand on her husband's shoulder, telling him to know his place. What nobody in that ballroom knew is that by morning,
Daniel Hart had spent 10 years married to Rachel, and for nearly all of them, she believed he was nothing more than a mid-level operations manager at Heartline Industries. In truth, Daniel owned the company. He had built it from nothing, starting in a rented office above a hardware store with 2 employees and a line of credit he barely qualified for. Over the years, he expanded it into one of the region's most respected manufacturing and logistics firms, employing hundreds of people and generating revenue that most of his neighbors could not imagine. Yet he kept his name off the public materials, avoided press interviews, and let his executive team handle anything that required a face for the cameras. He never saw the need to prove himself to strangers. He assumed, for a long time, that he did not need to prove himself to his wife either. Rachel had married Daniel when they were both in their late 20s, back when Heartline Industries was still small enough that Daniel worked 12-hour days just to keep it afloat. In those early years, she admired his discipline, his refusal to take shortcuts, and the quiet confidence he carried even when money was tight. She used to tell her friends that she had found a man who built things instead of talking about building things. But somewhere between the 10th anniversary and the 15th, something in her shifted. She stopped seeing his humility as strength and started seeing it as a lack of ambition. She wanted a husband who commanded a room the moment he walked into it, not one who blended into the crowd at his own company's events, nodding politely and disappearing into conversations about supply chains and logistics contracts. That hunger for something louder pulled her attention toward Trevor, a sales director at Heartline who had a gift for making people feel important the moment he looked at them. Trevor understood charisma the way Daniel understood spreadsheets. He remembered names, complimented outfits, and always seemed to know exactly what to say to make a room lean in his direction. Rachel met him at a company retreat 2 years earlier, and what started as friendly conversation slowly turned into something else. She began finding reasons to mention his name at dinner. She began comparing Daniel's plain button-down shirts to Trevor's tailored jackets. She began wondering, quietly at first, and then not so quietly, whether she had settled for a smaller life than she deserved. The affair did not happen all at once. It crept in through late-night text messages disguised as work updates, through lunches that ran longer than they should have, through the kind of attention that feels harmless until it becomes the center of your day. Rachel told herself she was not doing anything wrong, that she was simply enjoying being noticed again. But the more time she spent with Trevor, the more she resented Daniel for not giving her that same feeling. She began picking fights over nothing, criticizing the way he dressed, the way he spoke at family gatherings, the way he seemed content with a life she had started to see as beneath her. Daniel noticed the shift in her tone, but assumed it was stress or exhaustion or the natural friction of a long marriage. He gave her space instead of asking hard questions, a decision he would later reflect on with a mixture of regret and understanding. By the time the company's annual gala approached, Rachel had made up her mind about several things, though she had not yet said any of them out loud. She decided that she was tired of pretending to be satisfied with a man she now viewed as unremarkable. She decided that Trevor represented the version of life she actually wanted, one filled with attention, status, and the kind of energy she had convinced herself she was owed. And she decided, without fully admitting it to herself, that the gala would be the moment she stopped hiding her feelings and started living according to them. She told Trevor she wanted to attend the event with him, publicly, as his partner rather than his co-worker's wife. Trevor, flattered and emboldened, agreed immediately. Daniel, for his part, approached the gala the way he approached every company event, as an obligation rather than a celebration. He had never enjoyed the spotlight, and even after building Heartline into what it had become, he preferred to stand near the back of the room, checking in with department heads and thanking the staff, who rarely got recognition anywhere else. He assumed Rachel would attend with him as she always had, distant but present, going through the motions of a marriage that had grown quiet over the years. He had no idea that she had already made plans of her own, plans that did not include him standing beside her that night. If you have ever sat through a dinner knowing something in your life was about to change before anyone said a word out loud, you already understand the tension that filled that ballroom before a single toast was made. Stay with this one until the end, because what happens next is the kind of reversal you will want to see through to the final minute. And if stories like this speak to you, staying subscribed means you never miss the next one. The gala took place at a hotel ballroom downtown, the kind of space with high ceilings and chandeliers that made even routine corporate events feel like something out of a magazine spread. Executives, clients, and staff filled the room in formal wear. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of drinks, and a low hum of conversation filled the space as people caught up on the year's business and traded pleasantries they mostly meant. Daniel arrived early, as he always did, greeting the events team and checking in with the caterers to make sure everything ran smoothly. He had learned long ago that the people who set up an event rarely get thanked for it, and he made a point of thanking them anyway. Rachel arrived nearly an hour later, and when she walked through the doors, she was not alone. Trevor walked beside her, his hand resting at the small of her back, both of them dressed like they had planned this entrance for weeks. Heads turned immediately. Whispers moved through clusters of co-workers who had known Daniel for years and had no idea what they were witnessing. Rachel did not flinch. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind more times than she would ever admit, and she intended to see it through exactly as she had imagined it. Daniel spotted them from across the room and made his way over, assuming at first that Trevor was simply escorting Rachel to her seat, a courtesy between colleagues. He extended a hand toward Trevor and offered a polite greeting, the kind of professional courtesy he extended to everyone at these events. Rachel stepped forward before Trevor could respond and addressed the small crowd that had begun to gather nearby, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by the people she wanted to hear it. She introduced Trevor as her real partner, the man who actually understood how to build a life worth living, and then turned to Daniel with an expression that mixed pity and contempt in equal measure. She called him a nobody, a man who had never amounted to anything, someone who blended into the background of his own existence the same way he blended into the background of every room he entered. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it stretched long enough for everyone nearby to understand exactly what they had just witnessed. A few people laughed, uncertain whether this was some kind of joke between colleagues. Others simply stared, unsure where to look. Phones came out discreetly, the way they always do when something unexpected happens in a room full of people who sense they are witnessing a moment worth remembering. Trevor, emboldened by the attention, placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder with the kind of condescension reserved for someone he believed held no power over his future. He told Daniel, loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear, that he should learn how the company really worked before showing his face at events meant for people who actually mattered. Daniel said nothing in response. He did not raise his voice, did not defend himself, did not attempt to explain who he was to the room full of people now watching him with a mixture of curiosity and secondhand embarrassment. He simply straightened his jacket, nodded once toward Rachel and Trevor, and turned to walk toward the exit with the same calm, measured pace he brought to every difficult moment in his professional life. Anyone who had worked closely with Daniel over the years would have recognized that particular stillness, the kind that settled over him right before he made a decision that would reshape everything around him. Rachel did not recognize it. She mistook his silence for defeat. The drive home that night was quiet in a way that felt heavier than any argument could have been. Daniel did not call Rachel to demand an explanation, did not send a furious text, did not do any of the things a wounded man might be expected to do after being humiliated in front of colleagues, clients, and staff. Instead, he sat in his study for several hours, reviewing documents he had already prepared weeks earlier, documents he had hoped he would never need to use, but had put together anyway once certain suspicions became too consistent to ignore. He had known about Rachel and Trevor for nearly 4 months. Ever since a routine security audit flagged unusual patterns in Trevor's expense reports, patterns that led to a broader investigation touching multiple areas of the company's internal operations. What began as a financial inquiry had slowly revealed the affair as well, though Daniel had kept that discovery to himself, choosing to wait for confirmation rather than react out of anger. The next morning, an email went out to every department head, senior manager, and board member at Heartline Industries, requesting mandatory attendance at an emergency executive meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp. The message came from Daniel's office, though most employees assumed it concerned routine restructuring or a standard quarterly review. Rachel heard about the meeting from a coworker before she heard anything from Daniel directly, and something about the timing made her stomach tighten in a way she could not immediately explain. She told herself it had nothing to do with the previous night, that Daniel was too passive, too quiet, too unremarkable to orchestrate anything significant in response to what had happened at the gala. She arrived at the office building shortly before 9, still processing the whispers that had followed her through the parking garage, and made her way toward the executive conference room where the meeting had been called. When she stepped inside, she found Daniel standing at the head of the long boardroom table, dressed in the same understated suit he always wore, addressing a room full of senior leadership with an authority she had never once witnessed from him at home. The nameplate at the head of the table, one she had walked past 100 times without truly reading, identified him not as an operations manager, but as the founder and majority shareholder of Heartline Industries. Rachel stood frozen in the doorway, her mind struggling to reconcile the man in front of her with the man she had humiliated less than 12 hours earlier. Daniel continued addressing the room as though her arrival had not interrupted anything important, explaining to the assembled leadership that an internal investigation into Trevor's department had uncovered financial irregularities spanning 3 fiscal quarters, irregularities that pointed toward deliberate manipulation of expense reports and vendor contracts for personal gain. He announced that security had already been notified and that Trevor would be escorted from the building within the hour, his access to all company systems revoked immediately. Board members nodded along, several of them exchanging glances that suggested this outcome had been anticipated for some time, at least among those who had access to the preliminary findings. Security arrived precisely when Daniel said they would, moving through the hallway with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before. Trevor emerged from his office already arguing, insisting there had been some mistake, that he could explain everything if given the chance, but the 2 officers flanking him made it clear that explanations would need to happen elsewhere. Rachel watched from the conference room doorway as the man she had chosen over her husband was walked past rows of cubicles, past coworkers who peered over their monitors trying to understand what was happening, past the same ballroom entrance where he had humiliated Daniel less than a day before. She did not move to follow him. She could not, because her legs felt rooted to the floor beneath her. The board members who remained in the room greeted Daniel with a level of respect that made Rachel's chest tighten further, addressing him with the deference reserved for someone whose judgment they trusted completely, whose decisions carried weight because he had earned that weight over more than a decade of careful, deliberate leadership. She realized, standing there in a doorway that suddenly felt much smaller than it had moments earlier, that every person in that room had known exactly who Daniel was long before she had walked through the door herself. The humiliation she had orchestrated the night before had not diminished him in their eyes. If anything, his composed silence in the face of her cruelty had only reinforced what they already understood about the kind of man he was. In the days that followed, Rachel tried everything she could think of to reach Daniel, calling his office line repeatedly, sending text messages that shifted from defensive to apologetic to desperate, depending on the hour. Daniel did not respond to any of them, not out of spite, but because he had already said everything he needed to say the moment he walked out of that ballroom without raising his voice. He spent those days quietly reorganizing parts of his life that had been built around a marriage he now understood had been hollow for longer than he wanted to admit. He met with his attorney, reviewed the paperwork he had prepared weeks earlier, and made peace with a decision he had been circling for months without fully acknowledging it to himself. Rachel eventually showed up at the house they had shared for most of their marriage, arriving unannounced on a weekday evening, her composure noticeably different from the confidence she had carried at the gala. She told Daniel she had always loved him, that the events at the party had been a lapse in judgment, a mistake born from stress and insecurity rather than genuine feeling. She asked him to consider what they had built together over the years, the home, the routines, the quiet partnership that had defined so much of their adult lives before Trevor ever entered the picture. Daniel listened to all of it without interrupting. The same patience he had shown in the boardroom now extended, one final time, to the woman who had spent months undermining him while he remained unaware. When she finished speaking, Daniel handed her an envelope instead of offering a response. Inside were divorce papers, drawn up and finalized weeks before the gala had ever taken place, proof that he had known about her relationship with Trevor long before she chose to humiliate him publicly. He explained, calmly and without bitterness, that he had not acted out of impulse or anger, but had simply been waiting for the right moment to stop pretending their marriage was something it no longer was. He told her that watching her choose that night, of all nights, to confirm everything he already suspected had only made the decision easier to finalize. Rachel stood in the doorway holding the envelope, searching for words that might change the outcome, but none of them came, because there was nothing left to say that would undo what had already been set into motion months earlier. Trevor's collapse followed a similarly swift trajectory once his usefulness within the company evaporated entirely. The fraud investigation concluded within weeks, its findings detailed enough to end any possibility of future employment in an industry where word travels quickly between competing firms. He was formally terminated, named in internal communications that eventually made their way into professional networks and industry circles, and blacklisted by nearly every serious company in the region within a matter of months. The confidence that had once made him magnetic in social settings began to feel, to those who had once admired it, like the hollow charm of a man who had never actually built anything of substance himself. Rachel, who had once found Trevor's presence intoxicating, watched that same confidence curdle into something closer to desperation as his prospects narrowed and his reputation eroded. Without his position at Heartline, without the status that had made him appealing in the first place, Trevor became someone Rachel no longer recognized as the man she had risked everything for. Their relationship, built almost entirely on mutual ambition and shared indulgence, could not survive the loss of the very things that had drawn them together. Within a few months, Trevor had moved out of the region entirely, taking a position at a smaller company willing to overlook his history, leaving Rachel to face the consequences of that gala night entirely on her own. Word of what happened at the gala and in the boardroom the following morning spread quickly through professional circles in the city, the kind of story that gets repeated at dinner parties and industry conferences long after the people involved have moved on with their lives. Rachel found herself increasingly isolated from social groups she had once belonged to, many of them connected to Heartline through spouses or professional relationships that no longer extended an invitation her way. Job prospects in her own field grew scarce as well, not because of any formal blacklisting, but because the story had become well known enough that hiring managers recognized her name and quietly passed on her applications rather than deal with the complications they assumed might follow. Daniel, meanwhile, spent the months following the divorce rebuilding a version of his life that felt more honest than anything he had experienced in years. He continued leading Heartline Industries with the same quiet discipline that had built the company from nothing, though those closest to him noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor, a lightness that had been absent for longer than anyone realized. He began spending more time with old friends he had neglected during the later years of his marriage, rekindling relationships that had nothing to do with status or performance and everything to do with genuine connection. He took up habits he had abandoned years earlier: early morning runs along the river trail near his house, weekend trips to visit his sister's family a few hours away, small pleasures that had been crowded out by a marriage that demanded more compromise than it ever returned. 6 months after the gala, Daniel found himself at a smaller industry event, nothing like the scale of the annual company party, seated at a table with colleagues who had known him for years and respected him for reasons that had nothing to do with wealth or title. He noticed, without any particular anguish, how different the room felt compared to the last major event he had attended, how much lighter he carried himself without the weight of pretending everything at home was fine. He had begun, quietly, to consider what a future built entirely on his own terms might look like, a possibility that felt less like loss and more like clarity the longer he sat with it. Rachel, during that same stretch of months, remained largely on the periphery of the life she once occupied at the center of. She watched from a distance as Heartline Industries continued its steady growth under Daniel's leadership, as former colleagues who once greeted her warmly now offered polite but distant nods when their paths crossed. She had imagined, in the weeks following the gala, that Daniel's quiet nature would eventually work against him, that he would struggle without her presence, that the company would falter without the social grace she believed she had brought to his professional life. None of that happened. If anything, the version of Daniel that emerged after their divorce seemed more assured, more present, more fully himself than the man she had spent a decade quietly diminishing. The story of that gala night became, over time, something closer to legend among people who had worked at Heartline Industries during those years, retold not for its cruelty, but for the quiet dignity of a man who chose composure over confrontation in the face of public humiliation. Employees who joined the company long after the incident still heard versions of it during their first few months, usually framed as a lesson about the danger of underestimating people based on how loudly they choose to announce themselves. Daniel never brought it up himself, never used it as a story to burnish his own reputation, but he did not correct people when they retold it either, understanding that some lessons carry more weight when they come from someone other than the person who lived them. In the end, the man Rachel had called a nobody in front of a room full of colleagues turned out to be the only person left standing once the dust settled from that night. Trevor, the man she had chosen for his confidence and charm, had nothing left to offer once his career collapsed around him. Rachel herself remained caught between the life she had walked away from and the one she had gambled on, unable to fully return to either. Daniel, meanwhile, continued forward the way he always had, without needing anyone's validation to know exactly who he was and what he had built. Some people spend their entire lives trying to prove their worth to a room. Daniel simply walked away from the room that failed to recognize it and built something better without ever looking back. In the end, the man Rachel had called a nobody in front of a room full of colleagues turned out to be the only one still standing once the dust settled. Trevor lost everything the moment he stopped being useful. Rachel lost the life she mocked and the one she gambled on, left with neither. Daniel simply kept building, the way he always had, without needing a single person in that ballroom to validate what he already knew about himself. Some people spend their whole lives trying to prove their worth to a room that was never paying attention. Daniel walked out of that room and built something better without ever looking back. If you believe quiet strength always outlasts loud cruelty, hit like on this video right now, subscribe for the next story, and tell me in the comments, have you ever watched a quiet person prove everyone wrong? Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.